Amy Kadomatsu is the CEO of ComplySci, Jean-Marc Levy, former CEO of ComplySci and now senior advisor there. And as I said, more importantly, an Edison operating partner. Thank you very much for joining us, both of you. Thrilled to have you. And with that, I'm going to ask that everyone review their agenda book to get more details on the two. And I will let you guys take it from here. Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right, Amy, let's start with our own comedy routine. Can everybody hear us? Okay, in the chat, if somebody is hearing us, yes, thank you, Bill. Okay, so as you can see, the title of our session is Annual Planning. It doesn't have to suck. Well, it kind of has to. And so Amy and I are going to share some of our experiences with the annual planning and hopefully will help you get pumped and excited about your annual planning process. So it would certainly have been better having this panel 2 or 3 months ago when most of us actually kicked off the planning processes, but I still think there's a benefit to doing it now, and hopefully it's not too late to incorporate some of the principles we'll be talking about into your existing processes. So today's conversation, we're going to focus on the why we plan, because we always have, because we need a formal board-approved budget, because we're masochists, followed by the what of what's in a value-enhancing annual plan and how you need to tailor it to your own business. And then finally, the how of running a successful planning process. And we'll be spending some time on that because we'll be able to share some of the tools that really helped us and some of the areas in which, quite frankly, we can still do better. So the format is simple. I'm going to pontificate for a couple of minutes about each topic, and then I'll ask Amy to share her real-world experience of the lofty ideas and some of the lessons that we learned along the way. And then obviously feel free to send any questions you have to Lacey via chat throughout so that we can make sure we keep it interactive and that we can get to your questions. So before we get started, let's start with the answer to one of the survey questions that we had sent you. How do you rank your and your team's strategic planning and annual operating planning capabilities? And as you can see, the majority of you responded that you knew what you are doing, which is not surprising. I would have answered the same way a few years ago. More surprisingly, though, no one has it down to a science. So the question to you guys is, why not? Why should we not apply the same rigor that we apply to a lot of the other customer-facing aspects of our businesses to this operating planning process? And if you were part of the 60% who know what they are doing, I would argue that this is actually an even more relevant presentation for you. And so I'll ask you to indulge Amy and me for a few minutes and give us a chance to maybe challenge your thinking a little bit. So, very quick framing. What you're looking at here is a model that we've used at ComplySci for team building for several years now, and it was created by the Table Group, and it's called, Building High-Performing Teams. There's lots of other models out there. We just happened to use this one because that's the one our executive team coach was using, and the building blocks were actually pretty simple to understand. So it's pretty basic. Trust leads to productive conflict and debate, followed by commitment to the team's decision, and then team members hold each other accountable and have a relentless focus on the results. So that's the framework. We don't need to dig into a lot of detail, but I will posit 2 things to frame this conversation. The first one is that counterintuitively, it is harder to reach the top 3 stages of the pyramid than to climb the bottom 2. You're going to hear a lot about the bottom blocks, even today, as we talk about authentic leadership and trust within a management team. But what you'll find is that the top blocks, the commitment, the accountability, the results, are actually the key building blocks of this soft concept that we call alignment. And because alignment is such a ephemeral concept. It's one many leaders still struggle with, myself included. And so posit number 2 is, if we accept the first one, is that a well-run annual planning process will actually create alignment where it doesn't exist, and it will reinforce confidence within your team that they can actually achieve their goals. So why do we need a formal process, right? Strategic planning often has this aura of mystery. Strategic leaders, we admire them, we envy them for their brilliant strategic insights that seem to come to them as if in a dream, right? That's one of the reasons why we talk about vision. But the reality is that planning is a really, really labor-intensive process that involves a lot of hard work and connecting a lot of data sets and really helping build this cohesive business story. And so having a well-designed planning process will create urgency at the very least. It shouldn't be an exercise, quote unquote. As I mentioned earlier, in order to extract value out of the process, we're going to need to execute the annual plan and the development of the annual plan as if it were any other client-facing cross-functional initiatives. There really aren't any shortcuts other than doing the hard work. And last but not least, it should also be a highly iterative process, starting with the reaffirmation of your business's North Star, how you will win, and the resources that you will need to win. So let's pause for a minute, and I want to make this a little bit more concrete. And so I'm going to ask Amy, give us an example of something new or maybe even surprising about the business that you learned as part of this year's process.
So I don't know. I guess there are a couple of things that I would say that we did very differently this year that I think has also helped us in this particular process. One of them was that last year we had a very kind of loose number of check-ins with the board. This year we created an entire process. And so super painful, I think, starting to, when we do our executive offsite, Jean-Marc, in August.
Yep.
So that was kind of like the kickoff internally of that. And then there were starting to be formal check-ins starting in September and October, almost on a weekly or biweekly basis on different topics along the way. So that was really one big piece. I think that allowed us to align very quickly at early on in this particular process, like in early October, whether our internal view of what the business was going to do and what we were looking for aligned at all, or whether we were super far off in terms of the bid ask between us and the board. And I think that once you kind of know whether or not you're aligned or not, a lot of the other things then happen to come into play easier as you go along. But I think what it also did was, because we had so early on talked about this, it uncovered areas where we may have had white space or other kinds of things. And so I definitely feel like that was a big part of the good process this year.
And then, I mean, one of the things you talked about briefly is how iterative the process was this year. You want to talk about that as well? Because when most CEOs think of an iterative planning process, it's really centered around a negotiation of what the targets should be with the board or any other stakeholders. What tell us more about how iteratively we were very, very focused on making sure we revisited the same issues multiple times, to the point that Chris, who is probably still listening to us, was making comments about the fact that he had heard the same story 3 times.
Well, I think part of it is that, so what we did was, and we'll get into this, I think, later on in terms of like what a calendar could look like or whatever else it is, but we basically had to force ourselves to create first drafts of almost every part of the board presentation that we're ultimately going to do in Yes, Sugden. Yes, that's true. So early on in the process. I think that then what happened is that we basically had for each segment, whether it was go-to-market, for talent, for product and our product roadmap, even for our rally cry, we had these kind of initial first drafts with big brackets that we worked with the board, so we didn't feel like it had to be done. But it was a good first working draft that then we could really play off of each other in order to then get to the next iteration, and for the board to be able to poke holes in our thinking, so that by the time that we get to the board meeting, we have kind of a fulsome deck where everyone really feels like they've been heard and the questions are answered.
Cool. So you touched on kind of the elements of the plan and the pieces, and so I think that we can basically, that's not rocket science, and it won't surprise anybody here that the process can be broken down into a number of basic components, right? A go-to-market plan, although in the case of a go-to-market plan, I would argue that you're actually going back to the very, very basic, including a formal revisiting of whether your TAM assumptions are still valid. Then there's a technology and a product piece, which hopefully should include a confirmation of product market fit and opportunities to expand TAM. Then there should be a talent plan that says who are the people who are going to be doing this, and then a resource allocation plan, which for, quite frankly, many of us fast-growing earlier stage companies is really a cash management plan. And then for companies like ComplySci, who are a little more further along in their life cycle, we're now at the stage where we also need to really start focusing on operational efficiencies and all those things that make SaaS businesses the great investments that they are. So you will drown in data, but one of the outcomes of a well-run process is the ability to distill the critical strategic priorities for your business down to 6 to 10 key metrics that will move the needle the most for your business under the 80-20 rule. So it doesn't mean that you won't dig way deeper into certain areas during the process, but at the end of the day, you really need to shine the spotlight of management's attention on these key drivers. And we've often used the term ruthless prioritization, and it's one that we've used a lot, but it's one that's actually really hard to achieve. And so, Amy, do you want to talk about that and how you came into the planning process and how you decided which areas within the planning process to emphasize?
Yeah, I think, it's a great question, and it is really difficult because you do have to do planning across the entire organization. Even if you emphasize parts of this, it's not as if you can't have a plan for the rest of the parts of the organization. So you still need to go to kind of like to hit bottom on all those different pieces. But what I found was super helpful is that when I step back and help kind of our ELT, our executive team, think about, okay, what is the rally cry for 2021, and what are the key kind of objectives, and what are the metrics related to that? And we had kind of, I would say consensus around that, both with us and with the board. That became kind of like a very distilling process. And so I would say that like last year's areas where we dug into were different than this year's, part of which is because like last year we did, and into this year we did a huge amount of work on kind of operational efficiency, kind of in a post-COVID world, we had to do a lot of different changes. And so this year, I think we're starting at a point where there's a fair amount of operational efficiency, but it became clear that we had to focus on go-to-market, i.e. like we have this focus of an area for 2021. Now, does that actually check with the TAM analysis that we have and what we need to go after for 2021? For the tech and product roadmap, it became clear when we built our roadmap that we needed to think about it slightly differently in order to allow us to unlock the value we were expecting through the course of the year. And then in talent, kind of like how do we think about this in a post-COVID world? You know, I think with vaccines and other things coming out in 2021, you have to assume that things are going to change and we're going to come out of kind of this haze. And what we see is that there is some attrition. You know, markets are picking back up. How are we going to react within all of that? So all of these things made this kind of the three particular areas that we focused on this year, but it really drove out of the metrics that we were looking at. You know, top line growth this year is one of the key metrics is also EBITDA attainment, which is, you know, something new, not we hadn't really focused on that in the past. So grow, but not grow at all costs. You had to think about both growth and cost simultaneously, and then net revenue retention. You know, a big piece of that is then how are we continuing to delight our customers, and we've done leaps and bounds in the last 2 years to really think about that customer journey and making that really a delightful experience. And so how do we continue on that path? And so, sorry, that was a lot, but
no, that was great. That was great, and I can see I'm actually listening and while keeping an eye on the chat, and I see some. So Raj, for example, is asking a great question. Put a pin in it. We're going to come right back to that in a couple of slides.
Oh yeah, totally.
So,
yeah. Great question.
Let's move to the next slide if I'm not having challenges. Here we go. Okay, so now let's talk about the how of the process, right? The first thing, and I think one of the most important things to remember is that the planning process is not a finance project. It's not, there's a big temptation because there's such a financial component and such an emphasis on budgets and plans that the CFO, quote unquote, owns the planning process. That's a huge mistake. The entire executive team needs to own the planning process. And it's incredibly important, especially if you frame it around the perspective of alignment, which is what we talked about a little bit earlier. The second thing is what Amy alluded to in her comments a little bit earlier, which is you got to have a formal process, as painful and brutal as it could be, and you've got to run it like a military operation. And she described how last year we had some, you know, loose schedules and deadlines for our internal planning. But this year, we actually literally ran it with week by week milestones, meetings, and requirements for people to participate. And then just acknowledge that it's going to be painful, right? And that's, continue to strive for getting more perfect with every discussion and every opportunity to move the ball a little bit forward, knowing that you'll never be perfect. You're always trying to be more perfect. And then the last piece is you need to make sure you incorporate in your process some touch points and some opportunities for both your executive team as well as the rest of your organization to see how you're, you know, you have to do that. You have to walk that fine line of sharing how much of the sausage making to communicate and be transparent about and how much not. But the most important piece is to share enough of the process so that your team comes out of it on the other side, not only being like, great, we have a board approved budget, but really that they feel, oh yeah, we can totally do this. It's the right strategy. We know what we need to do to win. And by the way, we are confident that we have the right plan to get there. And then the last point is one of the key tests of a successful planning process is whether you end up at the end with one plan, one company plan that everybody knows about, that the board, the shareholder, the stakeholders, your employees all know about, or do you end up with a board plan, a bank plan, a internal plan? And so one of the big tests is that at the end, you should have one plan. That's it. There should be no excuse for having multiple plans. And then even though I just said that, within 5 seconds, I'm going to contradict myself and say, I can only think of a couple of times where it makes sense to have multiple plans. And one of these instances is one that we had at ComplySci, that I will ask Amy to talk about a little bit more.
Jean-Marc, okay, so is this related to, I can think of one of two things. So we have a mind meld, but I'm not sure exactly. So you tell me which one, what is related, because I think that there always needs to be a board plan and the management plan have to be the same. One number, which I think is a question, is what do you tell the company in terms of what your new bookings number that you need to hit, or whatever that top line number is going to be, what that number is going to be. Because as all of you guys know, when you think about commissions and kind of AEs and the build up to the overall sales plan and all of these other kinds of things, I think that is the one instance where actually the management and the board are completely aligned. We have one plan. But then to the company, you might say something which is different. I think in another way too, I think internally this year, and this might be also what you're talking to, and this is a little bit of responding to Bill's question about adjusting monitoring in 2020, is that if you think about kind of the post-COVID world, we came to a point in March and April where every single implementation came to a screeching halt. Nobody answered our phone calls for our potential prospects, and even our clients all told us they didn't have the time of day for us. And we didn't know what the future held. And I think there we came to kind of like, with you and the rest of the executive team, we came to some really tough decisions as to how we were going to then refocus and reorganize ourselves. And I think, Bill, we do weekly check-ins and KPIs, and there's a slide that Jean-Marc has related to that in the future, but also then did monthly check-ins. But this is where I think that our internal company plan differed from the board. So we had kind of like a worst case scenario, and we had what we were trying to work towards. Now, the fundamental piece of that is that the expense base related to that was the same in both of those cases, but we were shooting for a higher target than kind of our, I guess, what you call our worst case scenario in that case. And happy to say that we are continuing to work well against that plan and beating those targets and reforecasts and those kinds of things. So, I think there's a lot to be said there for the internal team. And Jean-Marc, I have to give you a lot of credit for that, which is really kind of like, I understand that we have to prepare for the worst, but I believe that we can execute at this next level, and let's continue to do that. And let's figure out what are the things that we can do to allow ourselves to get there and to prepare ourselves to get there.
Yeah, that's actually a great example. There's a side discussion going on in the comments that talks about the fact that Bob Farrell rightly points out that the planning process doesn't have to be painful as long as it's one that encourages the right type of discussion and strategic thinking, and that it should actually be an exciting process. Yes, I agree with Bob 100%. And from that perspective, I think that what we're also trying to convey here is that the painful part is that it has to be data-driven. And the painful part of the process is really being brutally honest with the kind of data that you need in order to inform some of those decisions, as well as whether your sources of data are reliable or not, as to whether it's a lot of digging and diving and mining for those insights. But I agree that the outcome of the process should be something that the entire organization should feel great and energized around. So going back to our slides, here's the fun part. We're going to share some of the actual quote unquote tools and artifacts that we use in our process. And I bet that you've never heard the word Pope before used in that context. No, we're not talking about John Paul. We're talking about another type of Pope.
We have a lot of popes.
Yes, but before we get to that, I want to share the planning calendar that Amy was talking about. I mean, you're looking at our real life 2021 annual planning calendar, literally. And you will notice that the topics and areas of focus are on the left: GTM, talent, product. And then what you can see is that there is this weekly series of formal checkpoints with various subsets of stakeholders. And so each colored box represents a different set of stakeholders. And so the light pink or salmon color is just basically executive management only. The gray meetings are topical check-ins with a subset of board member and their analysts and executives. And then finally, the 3 dark teal meetings are check-ins with a designated subset of the formal board before the presentation to the full board in purple. I know it seems like a lot of process, but it works. And for any CEO who has had the extremely unpleasant experience of having their board meeting derailed by an unprepared or misaligned board member in the first 5 minutes of the meeting, trust me, you have to trust this process. It works. It will not magically solve your misalignment issues, but it will surface them super, super, super early in the process so that there are no last-minute grenades being tossed and surprising everyone.
So Raj is asking about how big we are, Jean-Marc. So we've got about 86 people within the organization. So, you know, that might also color.
So most businesses, Amy, most businesses have some sort of annual plan timetable, but the reason we chose to create we chose to create hard deadlines and specific attendee requirements as to who was going to attend each session. What's the greatest benefit from your perspective of really over managing this process?
So I think that the biggest thing for us was that we got rid of surprises very early on. So you'll see on October 19th, and to be fair, the first rally cry check-in was supposed to be October 12th, but I pushed it back so I could have a little bit more time. Board in the check-ins. Oh yeah, so the BWT session, so October 19th, November 2nd, and November 16th, or those weeks, were the weeks where kind of like the broader board, we have both Edison and Vista, who are part of our process. And so there are people from both sides who've attended these particular sessions. So actually, but November 16th, I believe we canceled last week, at the end of last week, because we felt like we had enough check-ins over the course of this planning that we just didn't want to bore everyone to tears to review some of the same material or just have slightly different materials within those sessions. And so we called it off so we could continue to do work on our side to fill in some of the blanks. But I think the biggest thing at the beginning was really, okay, are we aligned on our ARR plan and high level budget? So this was kind of like a gut check, right? So the board has its guidance and targets and what it's thinking. Are we presenting a budget that's remotely near, or what is the bid ask? I think that was like the big thing that allowed us to basically, I think everyone collectively had a sigh of relief when we were reasonably within kind of like the bounds of what we were looking for 2021. The other piece is that we had to force ourselves to put pen to paper, and it always seems easier than it actually is. And then we also got initial feedback super early from the board of what questions people were going to have along the way, which allowed us to like fill in or go grab like data from a survey that we might have done, or, you know, we had a slide on NPS over the course of the last year, but there was really kind of a little bit deeper dive that we wanted to go do on that, and we could then go and do that in advance of the board meeting. So I feel like there is a lot of things that we did very early on within this that allowed us to feel much better about the go forward along the way. I also encouraged my teams, like my head of product and technology, to go and to surface initial conversations so that even before a board working team session, we could surface some additional commentary and things like that, and to start to socialize that information. I would say another thing is that, unfortunately, the thing is that work gets done in the time you allow it to get done. So if you force a timeline and a structure and you publish it and you tell the board, we're going to have a meeting on this date, well, surprise, surprise, everyone, you know, kind of rallies to get their stuff done by the time in which you present something to the board. And no one wants to look bad in front of their board. Certainly not your finance person, your product person, et cetera, your marketing person, your sales head. So everyone kind of busts their butt to try to get all of those things done. And as a CEO, it just makes your life a lot easier at the end of the day. And the last thing I would say is that while it's given me anxiety, I've been told sometimes boring is great. Oh, BWT is the board working team. So it's because we have both Edison and we have Vista, we have like this smattering of people who end up coming to certain kinds of meetings or whatever else it is. But I would say the last bit was about boring is great. And so Sugden is going to tell me, oh, this is so boring. I've heard all of this before. The good news is it's a sign of alignment, and Chris, you know, isn't surprised by anything that's in the deck. Alignment is good, but I am trying to come up with something to, you know, get Sugden's feedback on during the board meeting. So hopefully there'll be a couple of good, at least engaging discussions that we can have outside of like the basics of AOP.
Cool. So there's one more box on the slide that I do want to point to, though. It's the far right box. Because
yeah.
While the board meeting on November 30th or December, whenever it is now, that's not where it ends for us, clearly, right? And so what we're going to talk about talks to some of the points that I think Raj was making earlier about how far down into the organization do you really roll all these topics. So this is an example of basically something that is actually an artifact of the planning process, right? We've looked at 20 different topics. We've done our data mining. In the end, we need to be able to tell the company through our rally cry and what we call our quote unquote plan on a page, or POPE, how we synthesize all these multiple threads of inquiry into a robust operating plan, and to distill them in a way that they can become ingrained in the brains of every employee and every stakeholder. So the example that you're looking at is not very pretty, but for us last year was simple. 2020 was about, you know, our next generation platform needing to become more stable and move from a beta to a robust product. While we were stabilizing, we had to compensate with great customer support and success. And then at the same time, we started thinking about how to become more efficient as we scaled. And so the plan on the page and the rally cry was shared and reinforced in every town hall that we had, in every opportunity we had to have a discussion with employees. And so don't be afraid to be playful or cheesy or repetitive. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that your teams engage with the message and that they feel galvanized by this message. And so this is another example. You can be a little more playful. This is Amy's 2021 rally cry, which plays off the fact that many of our employees actually play musical instruments or are part of a band. And so we use the rock band metaphor to reinforce some of the key themes around teamwork and around carving and defining our own place in the marketplace as a business. And then whatever it takes, repeat, 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 repeat. And so again, this is a slide that Amy has used, and so that everybody knows what the company is about and what the key priorities are for this year. And so it may seem kind of ordinary and boring, but for employees who've been with us on our journey, for example, one of the things that they will notice is that for 2021, this is the first time that we talk about EBITDA attainment as a company priority and goal, right? That's because at this stage in our development, this is why we need to be focused on operational efficiencies. And so for the first time, we want our employees to really think about EBITDA. So Amy, when we first rolled out the rally cries and the company popes, there was a certain amount of cynicism within the organization, including management. Do you want to talk about the way we took the model even a few steps further and created those departmental and individual popes?
Yeah, so, and popes or plans on a page, certainly I didn't invent them. I think it was a way for us to think about, because I think what we needed to figure out was how to cascade the concept that we had at this very high level and make it real for the organization, for individuals, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, oftentimes I think what you have is that people are like, oh yeah, but I don't have anything to do with ARR bookings or net revenue retention. Those are just numbers that exist on a page. I would say there are lots of other metrics that we're capturing within the organization also, and that might be important in order to build up to these things. But basically, if you go to like the slide before, or go to slide 11 maybe, like, because that one is the one that we're still in today. You know, I think here what we did, and we've kind of changed this up over time, which is that we've definitely, you know, thought about lots of different kinds of data. There we had more than 3 areas or company goals that we wanted to go to. And that's very different from when you go to slide 13, kind of just the 3 that you just saw. No, we don't have to, you can go to either one, Jean-Marc, it doesn't matter. But I think here what we did was we took the company pope, then we asked for every single one of the departments. So whether it was sales or marketing or my customer success team or my customer support team, every single kind of like department and sub-department came up with their version of a plan on a page that included both some of the kind of iconic areas that they were going to try to look for, as well as then their data points. And so net revenue retention might be one of them, but for customer support, it might also be the fact that they were trying to get to a particular CSAT score or above, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of those different things so that we could then start to track what the important KPIs and metrics are for every single group, that then we could look at on both on a quarterly basis, certainly on a look back, and how individuals could then see how they build this, they kind of build up into the company pope. And so that's really the big piece for this, which is that how do you tie what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis? I'm a person who just graduated from college, sitting on a support desk, answering phone calls or emails. How does that relate to the ultimate goal of the company? And this was a way for us to be able to do all of those things and to give people that kind of agency that, yes, I'm making a difference into kind of the ultimate goals of the company, and everything that I do every day is super important. And so we'll continue to do this. You know, it's a work in progress. And one of the things is that we then started to also create kind of these quarterly goals for people within a system. Like at first we used to track it in Excel spreadsheets probably, and then we have moved on to other systems. So I think there really it's about then thinking and being able to look back every quarter on what we did versus what we had said we would do as well. And to then really think about kind of how we make it better going forward.
Thank you. That's great. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I apologize. We have a few minutes left, and so I want to move quickly with, I think we talked about a lot of the questions that came up in the chat. If there is anything that wasn't answered today, obviously you guys know where to reach us, but please ask any last minute questions in the chat. What I want to close with, though, is I want to share with you kind of one of the last artifacts of the planning process. And this goes to, I can't remember if it was Bill's question or the question of how often do we actually get together and look at the key metrics. And so this last slide that I'm sharing with you is an example of the way we use our plan beyond the one-time planning exercise. So what you see here is the dashboard that we review together as an executive team once a week, literally. I am emphasizing the together concept for deliberately. This is not a weekly dashboard that gets emailed to the management team and then gets buried in your inbox black hole. This is how we open our formal weekly executive meeting every single week. And every member of the executive team is expected to understand those key drivers and their impact on the business, and to come prepared to discuss and ask any questions. It doesn't matter if you're the chief people officer or the chief marketing officer. This is basically kind of what we expect you as a management team to be completely proficient in. And so I know many of you are looking at this and saying, sounds like a lot of work. So let me ask Amy. So some people here, I'm sure I can't see, are rolling their eyes a little bit, but let me ask a question I already know the answer to. A, do you really review these as a team every week, or are you guys just doing this to humor me? And has that changed the nature of your formal weekly management meetings and the discussions?
So yes, we do review them every single week in our main executive leadership team meeting. Two, I'm not going to lie, it's a crap ton of work and a pain in our arse to put together. And three, so true, Kelly. It's so true. But I also think that it forced us. So I would say at the beginning of this, so I'll give you an example of one that I was highly involved with, like the at-risk ARR, right? So at first, that seemed so daunting. We have 1,400 clients, kind of understanding, and we had data in lots of different places. And so aggregating that data and trying to understand where are we with those clients was one thing that was a really big challenge and question for us. And so I said, okay, well, kind of to one of your points earlier about kind of like not striving for perfection, but kind of just more perfect along the way. And how do you get to the 80-20 rule? We said, okay, let's just look at a portion of our client base and let's try to at least do a really good job assessing that. And you know what, to be honest with you, at first, it was on an Excel spreadsheet. It wasn't incorporated into Salesforce. That was like nirvana, was beyond what I could have even imagined at the time. But we started putting that together. And then as we became more proficient and we realized what we needed to have within kind of a Salesforce, and we had a guy who, I don't know, he's like, you know, one of these young, high potential types of people. He picked up Salesforce and started to just take classes on the side. And he was like, yeah, I'll help you create some pages. And so it turned out that, you know, we were very lucky, and we had a self-starter who then helped us create like a bunch of pages that we've called now Gainsight Lite internally within Salesforce to try to track stuff. But, you know, trying to be scrappy, but try to force ourselves to put stuff on paper in order for us to look at trends. And I think that's really also forced us to really ask around the table, like, hey, I'm seeing this trend. Hey, I'm seeing that information. What are we talking about there? Are you sure we're not doing everything that we can for X, Y, or Z, or how can we help to do those things? And I think that it just allows us to kind of like mine for additional conversation and conflict.
Cool, thank you. So I think I haven't seen Lacey's signal. Do we have a little bit of time left?
You absolutely do.
Okay. Amy, do you want to talk? Go ahead, Greg.
First of all, thank you both. It's tremendous. I hope we'll get a couple more questions. I'd rather reduce the break and keep this going. The chat on the side has been tremendous. I think it's a transcript actually for us. The question for you two is, you know, you have such a process here, and I want to make sure that everyone understands we're at all different stages, you know, from an earlier stage company all the way through to very large companies, you know, 9 figures in revenue. You know, how long did it take for the two of you to develop this process and really make it what it is today? Because I'm sure there are some people out there thinking, boy, this is a lot to do. And there are others that say it's not quite enough. And so I'd like to maybe focus on those guys who are a little bit on the earlier side.
That's a great question. And for sure, this is a process. Amy, cover your ears. I'm going to use the journey word. It is a journey. It's not, we're one of the things that we pride ourselves about at ComplySci is that we're always hungry for more. That's one of our values. And we're always striving to be more perfect, even though we'll never be perfect. And so I think that the process has evolved as we've grown as a company for sure. But one thing I will share with you is that even though ComplySci was way, way, way smaller when I first came in almost 5 years ago, I kind of wish I had put some of those processes in place a little bit sooner, earlier, because even for a smaller company, and I would argue, quite frankly, perhaps even more importantly, for a smaller company where every mistake can be so much more costly and damaging to the business, having that kind of process would have probably kept us from, stubbing our toes on a couple of issues as we grew to the size that we are today.
I would also say though, Jean-Marc, don't you agree that so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out leading and lagging indicators for our own business. So basically it was kind of like there are 3 million, maybe 1 billion things you could track over time, of course. And for those of us who are in these businesses, data is everything, and I love data. However, you can't track all the data and have it mean anything. And so that was really like a big struggle that we had. And I think that we got paralyzed in prior attempts, I would say, Jean-Marc, with trying to capture 3 million things across the organization, and that just was dead on arrival. We tried it for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then we were like, this is so freaking painful.
And it adds no value, which is the bottom line. So trash it. No value gets thrown in the trash.
Yeah. So I think then we said, okay, here's what is important now. And then even in the COVID world, there were a couple of things that then we added to the KPIs, and now we've deleted them from KPIs. So I think it's an ever evolving list of things, and you have to always take a fresh look at it to say, is this what matters today?
Yeah. And Chris makes another point in the chat is, again, you're not going to get it perfect the first time around, right? Take away maybe 1 or 2 ideas from today's discussion and really start playing with them. And one of the most important things that we talked about today is make the process fit your business, right? And the process should meet and should be aligned and match whatever strategic challenges or operational challenges your business is facing at the time. That's why you need to use that annual planning plan process.
Well said. As a matter of fact, it's a perfect way to end this part of the discussion. I want to thank both of you. It just also reminds me as we head into a break, every company, every business, it's both art and science in terms of these sessions, in terms of the planning. And I can honestly say that ComplySci, from everything I've seen over the past few years, as well as talked about and heard today, it's very clear that you capture both sides of it. And I think if we can also leave the other CEOs with that feeling of it's not all the numbers. It has to be about the leading and lagging indicators, as Amy just talked about, what your business is going to be, the popes, the rallying cry, and everything associated with it. Putting that all together leads to a great plan and usually excellent results. So Amy, Jean-Marc, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.